Imagine a civil war. Bayonets gleam, cannons roar, thousands clash in a desperate fight for power. Now, shrink that image way down until only three figures remain, locked in a struggle for an island. Welcome to the smallest civil war in history, fought not on sprawling battlefields, but on a tiny speck of land in the vast Atlantic. This is the story of the island of Crab Island, its three inhabitants, and their battle for supremacy. Our story begins in the late 19th century on Crab Island, part of the Isles of Shoals, a cluster of rocky islands off the coast of Maine and New Hampshire. Crab Island was a harsh mistress. Windswept, barren, and barely larger than a football field, it offered little in the way of comfort. Yet for three souls, it became a kingdom, and the stage for their peculiar war. Our protagonists, as bizarre a trio as ever graced a history book, were John, a gruff fisherman with a weathered face like sun-baked leather, Thomas, a wiry, quick-witted shopkeeper, and the formidable Maggie, a woman of uncertain age and even more uncertain origins, who ruled over the island's only tavern with an iron fist and a tongue sharper than a fishmonger's knife. These three, bound together by circumstance and isolation, would soon find themselves at odds, their ambitions clashing like thunderheads on a stormy sea. The Isles of Shoals were a world unto themselves. They had been a haven for pirates and smugglers, their craggy shores echoing with tales of buried treasure and daring raids. Fishermen hauled in their catches, battling the unpredictable moods of the Atlantic. And then there was Crab Island, the smallest and most isolated of the islands, home to our unlikely trio. John the fisherman was a man of the sea. Salt spray was his cologne, the cries of gulls his symphony. He knew the currents like the back of his hand, and his nets bulged with cod and haddock. Thomas the shopkeeper was a man of commerce, always scheming, always looking for an advantage. He ran the island's general store, a ramshackle hut crammed with everything from fishing tackle to molasses. And Maggie, the tavern keeper, was the heart of the island. Her tavern, the Drunken Gull, was the only solace for the island's inhabitants, a place where they could drown their sorrows and swap tales of the sea. Their lives were simple, their days marked by the rhythms of the sea and the changing seasons. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. John the fisherman believed his contribution to the island's survival was paramount. Thomas, the shopkeeper, saw himself as the island's economic engine, and Maggie, the tavern keeper, well, she knew the secrets of every man's heart and held the power of gossip and rum. Their ambitions, like ships on a collision course, were destined to clash. The spark that ignited the conflict was fittingly a fish. Not just any fish, mind you, but a monstrous halibut, hauled from the depths by John, the fisherman. This was no ordinary catch. This was a leviathan, a fish that could feed the island for a week and line John's pockets with gold. Thomas, the shopkeeper, saw an opportunity. He offered to buy the fish from John, intending to sell it piecemeal at an exorbitant markup. John, however, had other plans. He envisioned a grand feast, a celebration of his prowess as a fisherman, with him at the center of the festivities. Maggie, ever the pragmatist, saw the brewing storm. She knew both men, knew their pride and stubbornness. She tried to mediate, to find a compromise that would satisfy both John's ego and Thomas's greed, but her efforts fell on deaf ears. The two men were locked in a battle of wills, each determined to have his way. The halibut, once a symbol of bounty, became a bone of contention, a catalyst for the island's descent into chaos. The conflict escalated. John, with his self-proclaimed title of king, set about establishing his rule. His palace was his small, weather-beaten shack, perched precariously on the island's highest point. His throne, a rickety stool salvaged from a shipwreck. His scepter, a rusty fish knife. He issued decrees mostly concerning fishing regulations and the proper way to gut a cod, which Thomas the president promptly ignored. John's attempts to enforce his rule were met with amusement, then derision. His subjects, namely Thomas and Maggie, refused to acknowledge his authority. Thomas continued to run his shop, driving a hard bargain for every ounce of flour and every yard of rope. Maggie, in her tavern, became a listening post for the island's gossip, a repository of complaints about the king and the president. The island, once a place of harmonious isolation, was now divided. John, the king, patrolled his kingdom, a look of bewildered frustration on his face. Thomas, the president, held court in his shop, calculating profits and plotting his next move. And Maggie, the unofficial queen of Crab Island, served her customers, her sharp eyes missing nothing. The smallest civil war in history was well and truly underway. Maggie, the tavern keeper, watched the escalating conflict with a mixture of amusement and concern. She knew both men well, their strengths and weaknesses, their dreams and delusions. She had served them countless mugs of ale, listened to their boasts and lamentations, and she knew that this ridiculous feud could only end badly. So she decided to take matters into her own hands. Maggie's plan was simple, elegant, and perfectly suited to the peculiar dynamics of Crab Island. She would use the island's limited resources and the men's own inflated egos against them. She began by subtly stoking their rivalry, feeding John's belief in his royal status and Thomas's conviction that he was the true power on the island. She whispered rumors of plots and counterplots, fanning the flames of their paranoid imaginations. Then, with a theatrical flourish, Maggie announced a grand competition, a contest to determine the true ruler of Crab Island. The challenge was simple. The first man to catch a lobster of a specific size and weight would be declared the victor, his authority over the island unquestioned. John and Thomas, their egos inflamed and their competitive spirits piqued, readily agreed. Maggie, watching them stomp off to prepare for the contest, allowed herself a small, secret smile. Her plan was in motion. The day of the contest dawned bright and clear. The sea, as if sensing the drama about to unfold, was calm and inviting. John, the king, headed out in his sturdy fishing boat, his face grim with determination. Thomas, the president, followed in his smaller, more maneuverable craft, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. Maggie, from the shore, watched their progress, a knowing twinkle in her eye. The contest, dubbed by Maggie the Battle of Lobster Pot Shoal, took place on a shallow, rocky reef known for its abundance of lobsters. John and Thomas, each armed with a basket of lobster pots, maneuvered their boats, dropping their traps with practiced precision. They worked feverishly, their rivalry forgotten in the heat of the competition, each determined to prove his superiority. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The only sounds were the cries of gulls and the gentle slap of waves against the hulls of the boats. Then, almost simultaneously, John and Thomas each hauled in a trap and each let out a triumphant roar. In each trap was a lobster, identical in size and weight, perfect specimens of crustacean magnificence. Maggie, watching from the shore, threw back her head and roared with laughter. Section 7. The Fog of War. The simultaneous catch created a dilemma. Who was the victor? John and Thomas, each holding his prize lobster aloft, glared at each other, their faces flushed with exertion and indignation. Maggie, rowing out to meet them, surveyed the scene with amusement. She had expected a close contest, but this tie was beyond even her calculations. As if on cue, a thick fog rolled in, enveloping the boats and the surrounding sea. Visibility dropped to a few feet. The air grew heavy with moisture and the smell of salt spray. John and Thomas, their argument interrupted, looked around in confusion and growing unease. The sea, moments ago so calm, was now a menacing wall of gray, hiding dangers both real and imagined. Fear, a powerful solvent of pride, began to erode the men's resolve. Lost in the fog, surrounded by the eerie silence of the sea, their petty squabbles suddenly seemed insignificant. John, the king, looked small and vulnerable. Thomas, the president, his usual cockiness replaced by uncertainty. Maggie, the only one who seemed at ease in the murky chaos, took charge. Section 8. The Treaty of the Oyster Beds. Maggie, with a calm authority that belied her unassuming stature, guided the two fog-bound boats back to Crab Island. She used her knowledge of the currents and the subtle variations in the fog's density to navigate, her voice, firm and reassuring, cutting through the disorienting blanket of gray. John and Thomas, humbled by the experience, followed her lead without question. Back on solid ground, the fog began to dissipate as quickly as it had arrived. As the sun broke through the receding mist, casting long shadows across the island, Maggie gathered John and Thomas around a table in her tavern. She placed a bottle of her strongest ale on the table, along with 2 mugs and a clay pipe. She looked at the 2 men, their faces still bearing the traces of fear and bewilderment, and she smiled. "Well, gentlemen," she said, her voice laced with irony, "it seems the sea has rendered its verdict." A tie. Neither king nor president, just 2 fools who almost lost themselves in the fog. John and Thomas, chastened and thirsty, said nothing. They drank their ale, the silence broken only by the clinking of mugs and the crackling of the fire in the hearth. That night, fueled by ale and common sense, they hammered out an agreement, a pact of coexistence that Maggie, with a wink, dubbed the Treaty of the Oyster Beds. Section 9. Echoes in the Tide. The Treaty of the Oyster Beds, scrawled on a piece of parchment and signed with shaky hands, marked the end of the smallest civil war in history. John, the self-proclaimed king, and Thomas, the president of his own making, agreed to abandon their pretensions and coexist as neighbors, sharing the island's limited resources and working together for their mutual benefit. The halibut, the catalyst for the conflict, was divided equally, part of it consumed in a celebratory feast, part of it salted and stored for leaner times. Life on Crab Island returned to a semblance of normality. John fished, Thomas traded, and Maggie presided over her tavern, her ears pricked for any sign of renewed conflict. But the fog, and the fear it had engendered, had left its mark. The men's ambitions were tempered, their egos deflated. They had learned a valuable lesson, not from books or philosophers, but from the capricious nature of the sea and the wisdom of a woman who knew them better than they knew themselves. The story of the 3-person civil war on Crab Island became a local legend, a tale whispered in taverns and spun around campfires. It was a story about pride, greed, and the folly of human ambition. But it was also a story about redemption, about the power of community and the importance of listening to the whispers of wisdom, even when they came from the most unexpected sources. Section 10. A Civil War for the Ages. The smallest civil war in history may not have reshaped the map of the world, but it left an indelible mark on the tiny world of Crab Island. It was a microcosm of the larger conflicts that plague humanity, a reminder that even the smallest of stages can host the grandest of dramas. The story of John, Thomas, and Maggie resonates because it speaks to the universal themes of ambition, rivalry, and the search for meaning in a world that often seems indifferent to our struggles. The fog that descended on Lobster Pot Shoal was more than just a weather event. It was a metaphor for the confusion, fear, and uncertainty that can cloud our judgment and lead us astray. The Treaty of the Oyster Beds, forged in the aftermath of the fog, represented the possibility of reconciliation, the hope that even the bitterest of enemies can find common ground. And Maggie, the unofficial queen of Crab Island, embodied the enduring power of wisdom, compassion, and a good mug of ale. So the next time you hear the word civil war, don't just think of armies and battlefields. Remember Crab Island, its 3 inhabitants, and their peculiar conflict. Remember the halibut, the fog, and the Treaty of the Oyster Beds. Remember that even in the smallest corners of the world, the drama of human existence unfolds, offering lessons that resonate far beyond the limited confines of a tiny island in the vast Atlantic.